The recording session stopped mid-note. Frank Zappa lowered his guitar and stared across the small Greenwich Village studio with barely concealed disdain. On the other side of the room, Jimi Hendrix sat quietly tuning his white Stratocaster, seemingly oblivious to the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. What happened next would shatter one of rock music's biggest egos and change how the world understood the relationship between chaos and genius forever. It was October 23rd, 1967. The counterculture movement was reaching its peak, and New York City's music scene was a pressure cooker of competing artistic visions. Frank Zappa, at 26, had already established himself as rock music's enfant terrible. His band, the Mothers of Invention, was pushing boundaries with complex compositions that blended classical music theory with rock instrumentation. Zappa prided himself on being the thinking man's rock star, the composer who brought intellectual rigor to a genre he considered largely primitive. Jimi Hendrix, barely 25, had exploded onto the scene just months earlier. Our You Experienced had turned the guitar world upside down, but many serious musicians still viewed him as more spectacle than substance. All volume and no composition, they whispered in the jazz clubs and conservatory halls where Zappa's reputation flourished. The session had been arranged by Herb Cohen, who managed both artists and thought they might inspire each other. The plan was simple: throw two revolutionary musicians into a room and see what happened. Cohen had booked Studio B at Electric Lady, a cramped but well-equipped space where some of the era's most groundbreaking music was being created. Zappa arrived first, carrying his Gibson SG and a briefcase full of handwritten compositions. He was impeccably dressed despite the bohemian atmosphere, his hair styled with mathematical precision, his mustache perfectly trimmed. Everything about Frank Zappa suggested control, intellect, and artistic superiority. Jimmy wandered in 20 minutes later, his afro wild from the October wind, wearing a purple velvet jacket that had seen better days. He nodded politely to Zappa and the handful of session musicians Cohen had assembled, then found a corner where he could plug in his Strat and disappear into his own world. "So," Zappa said after the pleasantries were exchanged, his voice carrying that distinctive intellectual arrogance that made him both fascinating and insufferable. "I understand you're quite the guitar phenomenon." Jimmy looked up from his tuning pegs, his expression unreadable. "I just play, man." Zappa smiled the kind of smile professors give to students who've missed the point entirely. "Yes, well, playing and composing are quite different things, aren't they? Anyone can make noise. Creation requires structure, theory, intention." The session musicians exchanged glances. They knew Zappa well enough to recognize the beginning of one of his lectures about the intellectual poverty of popular music. But they were curious to see how this soft-spoken young guitarist from Seattle would respond. Jimmy said nothing. He simply continued tuning his guitar with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was listening to frequencies the rest of them couldn't hear. "I've heard your recordings," Zappa continued, apparently determined to make his point. "Impressive volume, certainly. Some interesting uses of feedback and distortion. But ultimately, it's just chaos masquerading as music. Where's the composition? Where's the mathematical precision that separates art from noise?" Still, Jimmy said nothing, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, like a cat that spotted movement in the tall grass. Zappa, emboldened by the lack of resistance, pressed forward. "You see, what separates true artists from entertainers is the ability to construct something meaningful from raw elements. Take this, for example." He launched into one of his compositions, a complex piece that wove through multiple time signatures and key changes with the kind of technical proficiency that left other musicians slack-jawed. It was undeniably impressive. Zappa's fingers moved across the fretboard with surgical precision, every note calculated, every phrase building logically on what came before. The session musicians nodded appreciatively as he demonstrated how classical compositional techniques could be applied to electric guitar, creating something that was intellectually satisfying and emotionally distant. When he finished, Zappa looked expectantly at Jimmy, clearly waiting for praise or perhaps acknowledgement of defeat. "That," he said with satisfaction, "is composition, structure, art with intention." Jimmy nodded slowly as if processing some complex mathematical equation. Then he reached for his Stratocaster. "Mind if I try something?" he asked quietly. "By all means," Zappa replied, settling back to observe what he assumed would be a crude attempt at replicating sophisticated musical ideas. What happened next lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, though everyone in the room would later swear it felt like hours. Jimmy began playing the opening notes of Zappa's composition. Not approximately, not a rough interpretation. Note for note exactly as Zappa had played it, with the same fingering, the same technical precision, the same mathematical perfection. But somehow, impossibly, it sounded completely different. The session musicians stopped pretending to adjust their instruments. The drummer's sticks hung motionless in midair. The bassist slowly lowered his cigarette, forgetting to exhale the smoke he'd been holding. Everyone in the small studio understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Perfect technical replication that simultaneously revealed the soul hiding beneath mathematical structure. Zappa's smug expression began to evaporate as he realized what he was hearing. His carefully constructed composition, the piece he'd labored over for weeks, refining each interval and polishing every transition, was coming back to him transformed. Jimmy had absorbed his entire complex composition in a single listening and was now playing it back flawlessly. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part came when Jimmy finished the composed section and kept going. Zappa felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't supposed to be possible. You couldn't just improvise meaningfully on top of mathematical precision. You couldn't bridge the gap between intellectual rigor and emotional authenticity in real time. Yet somehow the young guitarist was doing exactly that, making it look effortless. Without pause, without explanation, he began deconstructing Zappa's mathematical precision and rebuilding it into something organic and alive. The same notes, the same chord progressions, but now they breathed with human emotion. The technical exercises became a conversation between guitar and soul. Structure morphed into feeling, and mathematical perfection transformed into something that made the hair on everyone's arm stand up. Jimmy took Zappa's intellectual framework and filled it with fire, pain, joy, and longing. He showed how composition could be both technically perfect and emotionally devastating. Every calculated interval became a cry from the heart. Every planned progression became an exploration of human experience. But he wasn't finished. For the final minute, Jimmy took everything he just played, Zappa's composition made human, and began to fracture it with controlled feedback, strategic distortion, and techniques that shouldn't have been possible on a guitar. He created soundscapes that suggested both mathematical precision and organic chaos, proving that noise and structure weren't opposites but dance partners. When the last note faded into silence, the small studio was absolutely quiet except for the hum of amplifiers and the sound of 5 people trying to process what they just witnessed. Nobody moved. The drummer still held his sticks frozen above his snare. The bassist's cigarette had burned down to his fingers, but he didn't notice. Even the tape machines seemed to have stopped spinning, though the engineer would later confirm they'd been running the entire time. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. The kind of profound quiet that follows moments when reality shifts slightly on its axis. Zappa stared at Jimmy with an expression that cycled through disbelief, admiration, and something very close to existential crisis. The composer, who prided himself on intellectual superiority, had just watched someone take his most sophisticated work and reveal depths in it that he hadn't known existed. "How long have you been composing?" Zappa asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't compose," Jimmy replied, setting down his guitar. "I just listen to what the music wants to become." That answer hit Zappa harder than any technical critique could have. For years, he'd built his identity around being the thinking musician, the one who approached rock with classical rigor, while others stumbled around in primitive simplicity. But Jimmy had just demonstrated something that shattered Zappa's entire worldview. Intuitive genius could coexist with technical mastery, and sometimes, just sometimes, feeling could be more sophisticated than thinking. The session that was supposed to last 4 hours ended after 2. Nobody had the energy or emotional capacity to continue after what they'd witnessed. As they packed up their equipment, Zappa approached Jimmy with uncharacteristic humility. "That was," Zappa started, then stopped, apparently unable to find words that felt adequate. "Your composition was beautiful, man," Jimmy said simply. "Really beautiful. I just tried to find what was already hiding in it." Years later, in interviews and articles, Frank Zappa would rarely speak about that afternoon in Greenwich Village. When pressed by journalists or fans, he would deflect or change the subject. But those close to him noticed a fundamental shift in his approach to music after that day. Frank came home that night completely quiet, recalled his then-girlfriend Gail, who would later become his wife. He went straight to his piano and started playing. But it was different, more emotional, I guess, like he was trying to put feeling into the mathematics. The incident marked a turning point in Zappa's artistic development. While he never abandoned his commitment to complex composition and technical precision, his work after 1967 showed a new willingness to leave space for spontaneity, emotion, and yes, even controlled chaos. Albums like Uncle Meat and Hot Rats demonstrated a composer learning to trust intuition alongside intellect. Word of the session spread through New York's tight-knit music community with the speed of wildfire. Session musicians who'd been there found themselves telling and retelling the story of the afternoon Jimi Hendrix schooled Frank Zappa in his own composition. But the details varied with each telling, becoming more mythological with time. "I heard Jimmy played Zappa's song backwards while hanging upside down," became one version. Another claimed he'd played it entirely with his teeth. The truth was both simpler and more profound. He'd played it with his heart. The story reached other prominent musicians, creating ripple effects throughout the industry. Classical composers began attending rock concerts, curious about this guitarist who could apparently bridge the gap between structure and spontaneity. Rock musicians started studying music theory more seriously, inspired by the possibility that technical knowledge and emotional expression weren't mutually exclusive. 3 months after the session, Zappa released an instrumental composition titled "The Chrome-Plated Megaphone of Destiny" that featured extended sections where the written score gave way to guided improvisation. Music critics noted it as a departure from his typically rigid compositional style, though Zappa never explained the inspiration. Frank never talked about Jimmy directly, recalled Ian Underwood, a member of the Mothers of Invention who joined shortly after the session. But he started asking us to bring more intuitive elements to our performances. He wanted us to feel the music, not just execute it. The incident also influenced Jimmy's own artistic development, though in more subtle ways. Musicians who worked with him after October 1967 noticed his increased interest in musical structure and compositional techniques. While he never became a formal student of music theory, he began incorporating more sophisticated harmonic concepts into his work. Jimmy started asking different questions after that period, remembered Billy Cox, his bass player. Not just, how does this sound, but why does this sound work? He became curious about the mathematics behind the music, even though he'd never call it that. The influence of that afternoon can be heard in Jimmy's later albums, particularly Electric Ladyland, which demonstrates a new balance between his intuitive genius and more structured compositional thinking. Songs like 1983, A Merman I Should Turn to Be, show evidence of careful arrangement and musical architecture without sacrificing the emotional immediacy that made him unique. But the most profound impact wasn't on the music these two men created afterward. It was on how the industry understood the relationship between technical skill and artistic authenticity. The session became legendary proof that the debate between head music and heart music was fundamentally flawed. The greatest art happened when intellect and intuition worked together, not when they competed. Dr. Robert Christgau, the influential rock critic, later wrote about the significance of the Zappa-Hendrix session in his book Secular Music. What happened that day in Greenwich Village represented a crucial moment in rock's maturation as an art form. It proved that sophistication didn't require emotional sterility, and that feeling didn't necessitate intellectual poverty. Frank Zappa continued his career as one of rock's most innovative composers, but those who knew him before and after the session with Jimmy noted a permanent change in his artistic approach. He became less dismissive of musicians who relied primarily on intuition, more willing to acknowledge that there were different paths to musical truth. Meeting Jimmy taught Frank humility, observed his longtime collaborator George Duke. Not professional humility. Frank was never short on confidence about his abilities, but artistic humility. He learned that his way wasn't the only way to make sophisticated music. In 1982, 15 years after the session and 12 years after Jimmy's death, Zappa was asked directly about the encounter during an interview with Guitar Player magazine. For once, he didn't deflect or change the subject. Jimi Hendrix, he said slowly, was proof that musical genius doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like. I spent years thinking that technical knowledge and formal training were prerequisites for creating sophisticated music. Then I met someone who could take my most complex composition and reveal emotional depths in it that I hadn't known existed. It was humbling. The interviewer pressed him, "Did it change how you approached your own music?" Zappa considered the question for a long moment before answering. "It taught me that the brain and the heart aren't enemies. For too long, I treated them like they were in competition. Jimmy showed me they could be collaborators." Today, when music students debate the relative importance of technical training versus natural talent, educators often reference the legendary session between Frank Zappa and Jimi Hendrix. It's become a parable about the dangers of artistic arrogance and the power of remaining open to different forms of genius. The small studio in Greenwich Village where it happened has since been converted into a coffee shop, but musicians still make pilgrimages there. A small plaque by the door reads, "In this space, October 23rd, 1967, two approaches to musical genius met and learned from each other." That afternoon in 1967 didn't just humble one of rock's biggest egos. It expanded everyone's understanding of what musical sophistication could look like. Frank Zappa learned that composition without soul is just mathematics. Jimi Hendrix discovered that intuition supported by structure could reach even greater heights. And the rest of us learned that the greatest artistic moments happen when brilliant minds remain humble enough to learn from each other, regardless of how different their approaches to genius might appear.